Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Catalyst Knowledge Transfer webinar. I'm Saurabhishwar Sen, Chief Mentor and Founder of Catalyst, welcoming all of you once more to our endeavor to create more clarity and awareness of the emerging opportunities with social sciences as well as the social development sector. A little bit of brief of Catalyst for all of you. Since 2011 at Catalyst, we have been focused to train, guide, mentor students, working professionals for the career pathways into the social development sector. Our focus has been to develop human service professionals who can work in the intersectionalities of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and of course, the emerging emergencies with disasters. Since 2018, Catalyst also has been very proactive in supporting graduates at the different social science institutions in India to interface them strongly with the job opportunities in the social sector. We have been working with institutes like TISS, Azim Premji University, St. Xavier's, Mumbai, in order to bridge the gap to create individuals who are skilled, competent, and will be able to drive the sustainability mandate of our society for a better tomorrow. On that note, with our first webinar for the summer 2022, I would say, I'm delighted to introduce to all of you Professor Saumya Kumar from the School of Disaster Management at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Professor Kumar works on a wide range of issues associated with disaster risk reduction by considering vulnerability of societies living in hazard-prone areas. Her legal background helps to work with institutions on ensuring accountability and transparency in delivery of social services. Exposed since many years to higher education, Professor Kumar understands the importance of capacity building in organizations to train professionals to work on different global agendas. Thematically, she focuses on the relationship between climate change, development goals, and conflicts. She's skilled in international humanitarian law, curriculum development, public speaking, research, and teaching. She has published work on disaster policies in India, transboundary disasters, and international humanitarian law, and was also actively involved in TISS's intervention in Alappuzha district during the recovery phase in Kerala after the floods in 2018. We are all aware of how deeply impacted the country was with the Kerala floods. Professor Kumar holds a Master of Laws, LLM, focused in international and comparative law from WBNUJS, Kolkata, and NLU Jodhpur. Professor Kumar, we can't thank you enough to be with us today. And I would like to also share a little trivia with all the participants out here today that it was just not too long back, I think a little more than 24 hours ago, that we first spoke of an interactive session that we are hosting right now. And I believe I could sense there was some inherent, sense of urgency in terms of not just talking about disaster management as a course, but definitely about how each of us can play a contributory role in making our community more resilient in the face of maybe future crisis. So we cannot thank you enough, Professor Kumar, for being with us today. I would like to open the discussion with all the participants, and I would request each and every one to please feel free to use this opportunity and this session to steer your thoughts, share your ideas, ask questions, something that we should never stop doing, and really contribute to the story that Professor Kumar and the ideas that Professor Kumar and the perspectives that Professor Kumar is going to share with us to let us understand and also analyze the opportunities which lay ahead with the space of disaster management. I would also like to take a few seconds more, Professor Kumar, by sharing this a little sense of concern which is looming at the back of my mind. I am in Calcutta, West Bengal, and for the last 2 days, we are facing this entire, hourly to 6 hours update of this cyclone Asani, which is being formed in South Andaman Sea and is supposed to head northwestwards. And of course, we do trust our weather systems. But again, the question remains that last 2-3 years, we have been noticing cyclones, both coasts, in India. Again, we are in the face of a cyclone. If you can also, during the course of your discussion and interaction, maybe address this concern. For many who could be in coastal areas, for many who could be in places that is right in the track of the system that has developed. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time once more. Participants, over to you. And Professor Kumar, you're welcome to steer the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. For the cyclone, I mean, as you mentioned, the frequency of the cyclones in the Bay of Bengal and this sudden surge of cyclones in the Arabian Sea, I think we've not seen cyclones in the Arabian Sea before the past 2 years. We really have to accept that this is climate change, and this is more than enough evidence for us to see how climate change is affecting us. It is affecting us in our day-to-day life. I don't have to tell people from North India who are now suffering because of the heat wave what the impact is. At the same time, now there are, we are living in that reality where extreme events are a fact of life. And I'll keep talking about climate change, and I think you will see the kind of the changes, the dramatic impact it has had on our policies, on our governance system, and also on the kind of jobs we are looking at, on kind of opportunities the sector has to offer. Because I think now, with climate change being a reality, you need professionals, you need I could argue that you need a chief minister or a prime minister who is to be trained and who needs to have this kind of knowledge about disaster studies, because it's a part and parcel of your day-to-day life. So I'll keep talking about it. I'll keep coming back to climate change. That's becoming the most important topic, I think, in true sense. But thank you so much for that introduction. And welcome everyone for this session. I'm really glad to see that so many of you are interested in disaster management as a sector. We always find when students come in for a master's course or they come in for a certificate course, that there is always this question as to what can we do? I mean, what does disaster really entail? And I'm not surprised anymore. Every year we get the same response. We want to help people. We want to save people's lives. This is the kind of typical response we get from students when they apply for this course, because they see disasters as something which is relevant, where lives are to be saved. Because all of us have grown up with images of somebody saving someone in floods, somebody's house is destroyed, somebody is sitting on the streets and worried and cried. So those images have stayed with us our whole life, and those images are something which is a part of parcel of how we've grown up. I think wherever you are from, you will have some natural disaster which stays at the back of your mind. I'm from Lucknow, and my parents still talk about the one time Lucknow was badly flooded in the 60s. So that image, that conversation about the floods, what happened in the floods, how boats were there in the prime locations in Lucknow, that's a conversation in 60s where I wasn't there. My parents were also not there, but that stays and becomes a part and parcel of our life. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's good that students have that enthusiasm. We love that enthusiasm, but I do want to break some myths there. I do want to I expect all of you to have some form of reflection and go beyond just the idea of disasters being all about saving people. Yes, that's an important, very, very important component. But it's not just, being a part of a rescue force and saving someone from during a cyclone or during a flood. There are many, many more things in that. And that really opens up the avenue for a professional working in the disaster sector. Because if we talk about rescue missions, in our country, there are only two kinds of rescue missions which occur. One, and that's a case for a majority of the countries in the world. One is the government. You have a national disaster response force, which is trained, mandated to do all the rescue work. And then you have the second, in your voluntary forces, your good people in your society who come out of the way and want to do some good in the world. That's the only two system, one very formal, very institutionalized, and one very, very informal, absolutely no setup of institutionalization there. So that's the only rescue work you could ever see in your life. Now, that's not the only profession. That's not the only job a professional working in disaster sector can do. And for that, there are certain basic concepts which I want to bring before you, certain developments which have happened in the sector, climate change being a very significant one there, which really give us an insight into the fact that what all can you do in the disaster sector. Now, I will try to give you a understanding by the end of the session as to, what all can you do, what kind of activities one can do, what kind of expertise you can develop. But I do also want to add a caveat here that the list which I might give you, it's not an exhaustive list. It's a list which is just constantly growing. It's a list with every new professional coming into this sector is working on a different area of specialization and starting off a very different new avenue. I can tell you about my department in Tata Institute. We have around 10, 11 faculty members in the master's course, and none of us have the same academic background. None of us have similar. We do have overlaps. The disaster governance aspect remains the same, but our area of specialization varies completely. So I have a colleague who works on gender studies. I have a colleague who works on urban planning. I have a colleague who works on health systems. I have a colleague who works on rural and urban development, colleague working on mental health, a colleague working on economics, colleague working on social work, colleague working on GIS and science and technology. So a range of colleagues with whom I am growing in this sector as well, which really shows that how disaster is a multidisciplinary course. It's a course where you can be from any background. I mean, I've met professionals in the sector who are doing brilliantly, and they have a media background. They've done their graduation in mass media. So that is the kind of diversity which is there in this sector. And I think this is a space where so many of us have, if you have that interest, you have that basic fundamental understanding, there's so much more to do in the sector. So I take this opportunity to welcome all of you in the sector, to kind of help you understand this sector, and hope that, you are the ones who are now who will be bringing up a change, who will be bringing up a new area, new avenue of research. Because I can't give you just those 10 jobs, which are the jobs for disaster study. So I'm going with this caveat. You have that freedom in this sector to do what you want to do and do a good job. Yes, the underlying idea remains that we have to work for humanity. We have to work for the human interest. And as it is kind of perfect day on the World Red Cross Day also, that we have to focus about the fact that humanity working towards the interest of the human race is something which is a very core idea from where we come from. So just to start off with a very basic idea, and if any one of you who are interested in applying for courses on this, I think I've given you some of the I would be giving you some of the answers to the questions which you'll be asked in your interviews or your question papers here. But this formula which you see before you, which is risk, equal to hazard into vulnerability divided by capacity. If you make sense of this formula will really help you understand how this sector covers not just the response part, but covers so many elements within itself. Now, when we talk about disasters, we'll talk about cyclones, we'll say floods, we are all suddenly, preparing for a cyclone on the Bay of Bengal coast. We are preparing in Bombay, we are preparing for the monsoons. So we are all talking about a natural event which is going to occur. Now, that natural event in our mind is always referred as the disaster. We say flood is a disaster. But what flood, cyclone, earthquake are, they are hazards. They are your geophysical phenomena which occur, which create a situation like an earthquake or like a volcano. So your volcano is not a disaster in itself. It is a phenomena which you have studied in your geography classes, which you have studied back in the days, that this is what and how an earthquake occurs, how a volcano occurs. So that's your hazard. Now, what transforms a hazard into a risk or a disaster are vulnerability and capacity. So your vulnerability is the element of physical, economic, social vulnerability. How does the area where the hazard is occurring, how are they vulnerable? Now, a good example, I think all of us have experienced in the past 2 years, and I think it really encapsulates the importance of vulnerability, is the differing impact of COVID-19 on different communities. So a person who was a migrant laborer, the lockdown had a very different impact on him or her versus the impact of the lockdown on me when I had a house, I had an income, I had a family to support me. So in terms of my social vulnerability, my economic vulnerability, I was very, very better off, in a very, very better off position compared to a migrant living right across the street from my house. So that's where your vulnerability comes in. So it could be physical vulnerability in terms of the fact that I am living in an area which is in an earthquake prone area. It could be economic vulnerability, depending upon the financial resources you have, insurance, medical insurance. So that is again your economic vulnerability. And a significant part of this is also your social vulnerability. Social vulnerability focuses on the fact that, our society defines our assets, defines what kind of power we have, what kind of position we have in the society. And that really determines also our position in terms of a hazard as well. So a woman's role in the society, a woman is generally someone in a traditional setup may not be participating in the decision-making process. So her participation, the impact of the disaster on her is going to be very different. I'll give you one very interesting example. In Nepal, when the Nepal earthquake had happened, the earthquake occurred in the morning time. So a lot of people who were, who had gone to their farmland were outside, out in the open. But it was the women who were inside the house because they were cooking, they were taking care of the house, that they were very badly affected, physically affected by the earthquake, because they had debris falling on them. But when it came to distribution of relief, the relief distribution, when it reached the villages, it was done household wise. Now, when you do it household wise, in our normal patriarchal setup, a household is always known by the name of the male member. So, if the relief is being distributed, a lot of times the need assessment was done speaking to the male member. Even if you try to speak to the woman would, kind of divert the attention and put the, make sure that the man of the house is speaking and conveying the information. So this is how the vulnerability, the social vulnerability, the social position of the woman makes her vulnerable in the context of a disaster. The same applies in terms of caste, in terms of gender. So the vulnerability, therefore, has different aspects associated with it. Again, this is an element which we really don't talk much about. This is an element where, unless and until you've gone to the area, you've seen the sector, you will not really be able to get a sense of that. So vulnerability, therefore, one term, but within itself, it covers a wide range of issues. So when we teach vulnerability, when we talk about vulnerability in class, we start with caste, we look at gender, we look at physical vulnerability. So there are a whole range of issues which are covered within the whole idea of vulnerability. Development-related migration, development-related issues, they are all covered within this element. And the mitigating factor of a disaster is capacity. Capacity essentially means how well are you trained to deal with a disaster. If you are living in an earthquake-prone area, so if you are living in an earthquake-prone area and your buildings are retrofitted, your buildings are constructed in a proper manner, that they are earthquake resistant, or can take up an earthquake to a particular kind of level, that's your capacity. That's a plus point in what you have done. Capacity can also come in the forms of proper training, first aid trainings. So there are, again, a whole range of capacities. And here again, your traditional knowledge, nature-based solutions, traditional communities having their own ideas about how they can save themselves or how they can create mitigation strategies, all of that would fall under this strategy, under the term of capacity. So if you look at a disaster or the risk of a disaster, so how risky is it for you to stay in a city like Delhi, for example? Delhi, prone to earthquakes, prone to flooding in some parts. That's one element of hazard. Capacity is what kind of training has been done. So is the Delhi Municipal Corporation, has it worked on training? Are there first aid kits available? How many hospitals are available? What kind of facilities have been provided by the government, by civil society, by community? That kind of falls in community. And vulnerability, which is actually, therefore, if you look at Delhi, is a very interesting area of study. Because you could have an area which is extremely, extremely rich. You could have an area where there are beautiful, extremely rich, upper middle class families residing. And in the same locality, on the next street, you would have a slum colony. Now that slum colony in an earthquake situation will be completely destroyed. While, slightly good, expensive houses might not really feel that kind of severity of the disaster. And again, as I said, COVID-19 is therefore a very, very interesting example of understanding this equation. Now, if you understand and get a sense of what these elements mean and its significance with respect to a disaster event, you will be in a position to understand how disasters are not just a very simple event like a flood or just a simple event like a cyclone. A slight complication I'll give you, if you see the table, the chart at the bottom, this is showing, this is an IPCC report, which is showing the impact of climate change. And here again, in this impact, you could see, I'm not getting into the details of what are the specific aspects, but you could see clearly that the blue circles indicate how climate change is, of course, going to increase the frequency of hazard. So we were just talking about, cyclones in the Arabian Sea, increasing frequency of cyclones, heat waves in South Asia. You have, again, issues of wildfires in Australia, in America, increased frequency, increased intensity. Hazards are going to increase in frequency. Similarly, your vulnerability is also going to increase because climate change is going to affect livelihoods. It is going to affect the way we handle our governance system. It is going to affect the economic gains. It is going to affect the economic positions of people. It's going to affect the social position of the people. So this entire equation of hazard, vulnerability, and capacity is going to be very severely affected by climate change. So that's one slight complication, if I can take the liberty to use the word. Then another misconception which I want to break for everyone, and if you're interested in the disaster sector, I would say just remember this line, and that will really, break up a lot of the misconceptions we have. Now, I'll give you some, recent examples, but again, I'll take the example of Bombay. Bombay monsoon rains, every year we have the rains. It's a very natural phenomenon. Bombay has had rains since its existence. I mean, it's a natural phenomena. Bombay is bound to have rains, some insane amount of rains we have seen. But it's not every year that we have floods. We've had cases where the rain has been really, really heavy. I think the past, 3 years back, the rain was insanely heavy. But we really did not have floods the way we had it in 2005, 2009, 2014, 2016. It wasn't as bad as that, although the volume was insane. So there is a natural phenomena, that is your hazard, which is happening. But there are other things which are having an impact. And this is where your understanding of vulnerability capacity is very significant. Because yes, you have your monsoon rains. Last year, why didn't Bombay flood that badly? Because now Bombay has water pumps purchased, very heavy duty water pumps purchased and located in different locations in Bombay, as well as you have, a huge network of storm drain pipes. That doesn't mean that there are no incidents in Bombay. I do want to point that out, but the kind of severity of floods has not happened. So that means we have worked on our capacities. We have worked on having some form of improved technology, better prediction, better management of resources. So there is this aspect of a natural event which we have managed to deal with. But there are, again, examples where we have really kind of aggravated the situation. So a very well-known example was that of the Chennai floods. Chennai floods in 2015, again, massive amount of rain, insane amount of rain, broke all records, completely understandable, acceptable. But the kind of flooding which occurred, that kind of flooding could have been avoided. And this is not me saying that, or a social science researcher making that claim, but these are your government documents making statements, not going completely, making it very drastically obvious, but making clear statements, the CAG reports coming up and making clear statements that maybe the Chennai floods, the water levels, yes, you couldn't have done a lot considering the amount of rains, but the intensity of the floods could have definitely been reduced. And this is where the element of no natural disaster really comes in. You have a natural phenomena, which is the rain, the rains playing havoc in Chennai. But Chennai as a city, Chennai is an old city. Chennai has had a history of rulers, the British rule as well. Chennai had a history of having lakes, artificially man-made lakes in different parts of the city. Now, these lakes acted as reservoirs. These lakes were able to store excessive water and prevent the flooding of the surrounding areas. And these lakes have existed for hundreds of years. But in the past 50, 60 years, these lakes became prime property. These lakes were reclaimed. These lakes were, sold as prime real estate property. At the same time, a lot of these low-lying areas, because they were kind of, the water was removed, there was land there, but maybe there were portions where the real estate market did not rise up. And in those locations, you have slum localities coming up. So now you have a system which the city had where water could have been collected. And that collection area was completely removed. There are amazing images images which are shared online, which you can definitely check out, which really show how these sites have really shrunk down. Now, the cause of the severity of the Chennai floods was attributed to the shrinking of these water spaces. So it's a natural phenomena, a lot of rains, but the shrinking of the lakes is the human element which comes in. Now, when I say shrinking of the lake, I mean, it's not just, one person decided that, okay, I'm going to reclaim this land and I'm going to, sell it to a real estate agent. No, it really represents layers and layers of governance mismanagement. It represents layers and layers of corruption at local level, within the government, outside the government, civil society failure, complete failure of urban planning and urban management. So there are a whole range of actors and issues which are involved here. So it's not a very simple process as the lake was destroyed or taken away. So a whole range of actors and stakeholders kind of failed to do their job. And that's where we had such severity in the Chennai floods. A more obvious example, very recently in 2021, 2021, you have the Chamoli flash floods in Uttarakhand, primarily because you have excessive number of hydroelectric plants being constructed all along the rivers in Uttarakhand. So you have a massive amount of research literature which is available, which shows how these hydropower plants are so problematic for these sensitive areas. And you had a prime example last year where, because of the construction of dams, you have a flash flood, which again subsequently went on to damage a power plant yet again. So, and these are all repetitive incidents. They are all going to occur multiple times, and we are going to see more and more of these incidents. So that really helps us understand that at one end, we as humans are aggravating and increasing the frequency of hazards. We also have a very big role to play in climate change as well. At the same time, when we talk about vulnerability, we are also responsible for increasing vulnerability. So Chennai is a good example where we increase the physical vulnerability. Social vulnerability, our caste-based, religion-based, gender-based distinction continue to sustain. So if you have a divided society where decision-making processes are not inclusive, your social vulnerability is always going to be very, very low. So, in that's where researchers, practitioners in the sector say that there is absolutely that distinction of natural and man-made disaster does not exist anymore, because all natural disasters, so to speak, we have a role to play. It might not be one person, in a train accident, in a fire accident, you can name one person who's responsible for the act. So maybe in a natural disaster, you can't say one person who's responsible, but yeah, maybe as a human race, we have contributed to this increase in frequency of hazards, more vulnerabilities, and not really taking note of, all the red flags which are coming our way and doing something about it. So we really are not even working on our capacities to the full effect, to using technology and really working towards that. Now, the reason why there seems to be some kind of a problem in that area, and why I started the conversation by telling you that yes, our focus is only on rescue. We focus a lot on saving lives, and that's where our idea of disasters really is located. The problem there is that when we talk about disasters, our focus has only been on response. Now, that's not just as a fault or as of the society per se. Governments, institutions, NGOs, they've all focused for a very long period of time on response. Because response is something which is like, it's an ultimate situation. And if the state doesn't intervene, who else is going to intervene? But the sector has evolved. And in the past 2 decades, you have this very simplified. There are problems with that. So if you get into a master's course, we'll discuss why this is a problematic cycle. But this disaster management cycle represents the different kind of tasks which are required in a disaster. So it's not just after the flood that, you just get your boats together and save the person's life. Why did this flood happen? Could we prevent this flood? Now, if the flood has happened, can we ensure that a flood like this doesn't occur again? So, I mean, if we had the Bombay floods, the big problem was that our lines were choked. We did not have pumping stations. So now you gradually work towards having more and more pumping stations. So you learn from all your past events, and you will have subsequent events. I mean, monsoons are not going to end for Bombay. I mean, I think that will be another, kind of a catastrophe if monsoon ends in Bombay. I think we will not be able to live in Bombay if that happens. But this is like a cycle which is going to continue for a period of time. I do want to add this cycle is highly problematic. I think the image on the right really represents it in a better way, but it really is, a very important academic point. So any literature you read on disaster will start with this disaster management cycle. But it's very important to remember that our focus seems to be on this red portion, respond to disaster. We don't really care about preparation, mitigation. That's completely irrelevant. And recovery, I think even academicians don't really talk much about it. So this is an area which needs more work. And this is the area where your disaster management professionals have been working tirelessly, and area where so many avenues really kind of come together. Now, I'm not really, that's where, a larger definition of this term called disaster risk reduction has happened, because disaster management would keep you in that response phase. It's managing a disaster. What happens after a disaster? Risk reduction, therefore, is a larger terminology which brings in mitigation, which brings in preparation. So you're not just focused on the response part, but you're looking at people's vulnerability. You're looking at the fact that why is this community more exposed? Why does this community get affected every year? So that's a larger umbrella of DRR, or disaster risk reduction. Now, I'm not going to get a lot of detail into this. I also am looking at the time, but now if I have to take you through a decision-making process, what happens if we have to really focus on mitigation and preparation, and that's where our professionals really kind of play a very significant role. This is a reservoir, a Palomar reservoir. We're looking at Chile in South America. You can definitely read about the reservoir, but I mean, this is a significant location in terms of livelihood, in terms of water supply. So this reservoir has a lot of significance for the local population in the region, and the rainfall patterns is varying. It's an area which is very severely affected by the El Nino southern oscillation. So you have, the raining patterns. You have 1 year where there is a lot of rain and 1 year where there's absolutely no rain. So that's the impact of climate change again, which is setting in. So you have agriculture dependency here. You have, livelihood dependency here. You have cattle rearing here. So livelihood-wise, very, very significant area. But you also have incidents of droughts in this region. So 2010 to 2015, you have a period of very, very severe drought. The levels of the reservoirs have gone down. There is increased dependency on irrigation. So you want water as in an agriculture sector, but you're taking the water from somewhere else. Now, how do you make sure that this reservoir remains sustainable? So you have drought, you have dependency of irrigation, dependency of agriculture. What do you do in this case? Now, this is where this future planning of this reservoir is going to be based more on informed decision about the kind of risks which are there. which essentially means, if you go back to your formula, is your hazard, vulnerability, and capacity. So you're going back to those fundamentals and trying to get a sense of what has happened, what can we do about it. So they do carry out a lot of, a lot of data is collated. They collate data in terms of rainfall data. They put together mapping. They get satellite data, use that data to see the transition. They get data on the population which is dependent on them, on the reservoir, to get a sense of what would be the future dependency of people on the reservoir. So you look at stakeholders, you look at historical data, you bring all of that together to get a sense that, okay, till 2030, what kind of hazards are we dealing with? Again, here, why I wanted to bring this is because they do look at climate change having an impact. They again try and get a sense of the vulnerability. They try to get an information about the projected level of precipitation. So all of this work is not done by one person. Even in our country, all of this planning process is never done by one person. It might be funded by the government because this is an expensive process. It might be funded by the government, but the work of getting the satellite maps, doing spatial analysis, getting the data about the local people, getting a village profile, getting a vulnerability assessment done is again done by professionals who are working in the disaster sector. So this task which is there before you, it's a very simple case study assessment report which is there, but it really represents 50, 60 people who have worked together on this project to arrive at a set of instructions which kind of help in planning for the reservoirs. What do you have to do now? What kind of adaptation strategies you have to bring in? What kind of decision-making processes have to be undertaken? What kind of strategies adopted by local people is to be facilitated and what is to be set aside? So this is a very basic study which has been carried out, which is carried out even till date. Governments across the country in India are carrying out similar strategies. You have social impact assessments, environment impact assessment, disaster management plans, which are all based on data, which are all based on information and analysis, rather than being a very simplified, narration of what the reality is. We are, that age and era is behind us. Okay, so with that, I want to come to like the final part, where I just wanted to point out some kind of work which all of you could be doing once you have a sense, you've maybe gone through a master's course or a certificate or a diploma. What you could do, especially in India, I'm still keeping myself to India here, but you have similar corresponding areas in different countries as well. On the left hand side are sectors which are your more traditional sectors. We get students from having expertise from a lot of these sectors, their interest in a lot of these sectors, and all of this comes together when you are working, when you are studying in the disaster sector. As I said, all my colleagues kind of come in from all of these backgrounds and many, many more. So all these traditional sectors have evolved and have really worked towards creating a whole range of opportunities which exist in the disaster sector. And I say that I'm from a law background, but over a period of time, I have realized that even though I'm from a law background, I do need to know more about gender. I do need to know about health studies. I do need to get more on economics or architect and media communication. So I have to evolve over a period of time. So that's where disaster studies is a interesting mix, because as a student, you will learn about a lot of these different sectors where you might not have worked before, and you get to do a whole range of very, very interesting work. The first one being response. As I said, everybody wants to save lives. So what kind of training is to be given? You can work as a training professional, you can work with NGOs, work with governments to work on training process. Then a very important and very recent development as an academic program is supply chain. Supply chain management of resources, of first aid kits, training material, response work, all of that falls under supply chain management. So your humanitarian supply chain management is a very, very significant area, and unfortunately has recently received attention. Then you have EWS, which is basically your early warning system. So people with background in technology, people with background in sciences really find the space in EWS, because now we are looking at not just the IMD giving a declaration to the Home Minister, Chief Minister. We are also talking about how can the early warning move from the IMD department to the last person who is standing on the coast of Andhra Pradesh and will be affected by the cyclone. So how does that transmission happen? How quickly does that transmission happen? And what kind of very cheap technologies can be used to really facilitate that kind of last mile connectivity? Data analytics, spatial analysis, these are all data analytics. When you are dealing with big data, you're trying to collate information in terms of SDGs. This is where the sector really is kind of moving. Spatial analysis, urban and rural planning. All your architects or your urban planners have to kind of orient themselves towards the element of disasters, looking at whether which zone you fall in the country. Is it an earthquake prone zone or a flood risk zone? Or so there are different zonings which have been done in any city. So I mean, you can pick up the map of your own city and you will find that there are different zonings which have been done. So you might feel that, okay, we don't have floods in our city, but your city will have a flood zoning map. Your city will also have a development plan and a disaster management plan. So as per the Disaster Management Act, cities, villages, districts are supposed to have disaster management plan, that in case of a disaster, what should they be doing? So phone numbers, what are the strategies which are there? So figure out what kind of hazards which are there, and then correspondingly have strategies for evacuation, first aid, that kind of preparedness, so that everybody in the village knows what is to be done, is your DM plan. Again, our students work on that. With disasters, as I said, because vulnerability is such a key component, the element of working on social welfare policies is also a very important part. So if you're talking about improving physical social vulnerability, students often end up working on welfare schemes like Naregas, your PDS systems, your school education programs. All these are social welfare mechanisms which are very closely linked to disasters, and students end up working in this sector, working in terms of enforcement with governments or civil society, as well as working on monitoring and evaluating these schemes. How effective was it? How many people were covered in the scheme? Why were people left out? If they were left out, why were they left out? And all of this feeds into, the whole process of policy analysis. So if you're evaluating Narega, what are the flaws in Narega? What are the gaps in Narega? A very big flaw in Narega, which we kept talking about, say, the past 5 years, was that Narega is not focusing on disaster at all. It doesn't really look at disaster. And this is something which really came up in COVID. And when the whole migrant crisis happened, the government had this policy analysis, which told them that Narega can be used effectively in cases of disaster. And Narega eventually became a very important source of providing livelihood in villages. So these are all, I'm not saying one person has done it or one student has done it, but, across the spectrum, students have worked on enforcing policies, working on policies, and therefore analyzing and kind of feeding back into the loop as well. So the support to government institutions is a very big part in which our students get involved in. Many students who work in the disaster sector get involved, and not just in India, across the world, because see, governments are trained for public administration. Governments are trained for governance. Disaster is a very unusual work for them, and they are primarily trained for response. They are not trained to look at the development issues leading to disaster. So that's where, academicians and professionals really come in. I think it was mentioned that I had worked in Kerala during the floods, and our work there was to support the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority in terms of understanding their supply chain management. So we understood the supply chain management, understood how did it fail during the floods, and then submitted a report about the kind of actions they could have taken. So that's a very direct way in which we contributed to a social welfare scheme and worked on policy analysis and then subsequent advocacy. So that's a very important part in India as well as abroad where professionals really work on. Then there is another very, it's not a small portion, I would say, I think COVID has really taught us, is about building awareness. Building awareness about disasters. I think in COVID, the whole idea of communicating information about COVID became a very significant issue. So, I mean, in US, you have a massive political divide because how information about COVID was communicated. Fortunately, I think India did much better in that because the communication was happening constantly from formal institutions. But the subsequent media reportage was, again, very unfortunate in India. But that element of communicating about a disaster is very, very significant. We really dismiss that, but it's very important to look at how what kind of information is transmitted about disaster. So media, communication strategies, awareness level, integrating and bringing the community together, taking the information to the community, again, very, very significant aspect. And the last one, which is with respect to climate change, a massive number of students, professionals in the sector are working on climate change, prediction and modeling. What would be the impact of climate change? How do we quantify the damage which climate change would bring in? And therefore work on adaptation strategies, which could prevent hazards, which could reduce vulnerabilities, and what kind of capacities do we have to build up in this area? So there are a whole range of, avenues on which students can work on. As I said in the very beginning, this list is a list which I could, top of my head, these are topics which we cover in our class. Every year when we take some of the topics, we find that there has been like a jump of, say, 5 steps in a new direction. So this sector, therefore, keeps growing. And I think that way it's a very, very, unfortunately for the world, it is just the sector which is very much in demand, where we need professionals who have an understanding of a basic understanding as well as the kind of strategies which can be involved. And that is something which I see a lot of young people coming in and bringing in much more with them to the sector and really enriching the sector. And that's my reason, as I said, for coming here and welcoming more people in the sector, and hope to interest some of you in this sector. So thank you so much. That's my time. Okay. Oh, perfect. In very good time. I'm glad.
Thank you. So I think we really did not feel the time, Professor Saumya, because this really has been an eye opener. And I think on behalf of the student community, also being a mentor, this is so important for us, as you mentioned, that how the sector itself is so dynamic. Our individual abilities of also to unlearn and adapt, accept, and then possibly again repeat, right? The entire process. That is going to be one of the backbone which I can understand from the take back. Of course, the the interesting aspect of disaster management, which I hope our aspirants would also have taken a note of, that it is certainly a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary course. It also has its outcomes stretched across different sectors.
Right.
The cobweb, presentation that we saw across health, public policy, environment, that really gender, of course, that really sums up the importance of disaster management. Disaster Management Act 2005, DM Act 2005, all of us used to read the government circular every month for the last 2 years. We would wait for the notification around the 26th to 28th of a month for what is coming up in the next month. And invariably in the circular from the Ministry of Home Affairs, the DM Act 2005 would be mentioned right on top, followed by the recommendations, right, from the government officials. Quickly moving forward, I would like to open the question and answer from any of our participants. Kanishk has raised his yellow hand. Kanishk, you can unmute yourself and also maybe, if possible, keep your video on if that's feasible, and feel free to ask question. And after Kanishk, we will go to Ayush. Thank you.
Ma'am and sir, can you hear me?
Yes, Kanishk.
Right. Ma'am, I found it very interesting when you spoke about, our cultural and historical methods in the context of Chennai, wherein the prevalence of lakes and aquifers essentially prevented disasters, right? So could you please enlighten us a little more about the historicity of, how we have in the past utilized techniques for disaster mitigation, and how we could go forward in the future for the same, instead of a highly technological approach to disaster management, and maybe permeate disaster management to the masses, and hopefully utilize smaller actions to combine for a greater mass effect.
Oh, that's a very interesting question, Kanishk. So there are, again, as I said, Chennai was a specific example, but there are many examples where, past experience teaches you as an individual, how do you kind of prevent this from happening again. So because of that, there have been a lot of traditional practices which have really helped communities to prevent this kind of strategies. There are strategies there are traditional practices in Assam where people have houses on stilts. So they have bamboo stilts which are slightly above from the ground, and they have their houses and everything on top of it. So there's like your house is practically on the first floor. Now this is done in Assam quite frequently because the Brahmaputra floods a lot. So this is where there are, again, examples like this where communities have figured over a period of time how they can have mitigation strategies. Now, as you said that can we move away and keep ourselves away from the technology driven approach? I would not say that we should keep ourselves away from the technology driven approach, but I would really emphasize on the fact that all your traditional knowledge needs to be integrated with the technology so it can be more effectively used. So if you're talking about, say, for example, the aquifers, the wells and the ponds in Chennai and in many other cities where it was used as a tool for disaster mitigation, flood prevention, have that lake use technology to ensure that the lake is protected. If you understand the significance of that lake and the significance in urban planning for that lake, use technologies like GIS maps to, map out how big it is, to get a better sense of how the flood zoning can be done. So use technology. So that marriage of traditional practices with technology is something I would really advocate for. But yeah, you are right that our drive from a policy perspective, from even civil societies, NGOs, UN organization has been towards technology, because I think somewhere you have instant results. You have very good focused results which show you, okay, yes, there's a map which has been made. A map has been made, but by destroying, say, a properly structured flood management practice, which, a lot of places, local places in North India have bunds, where they construct a mass of land, where they block the river so that they can manage how the water will flow. So if your map has figured out, you've used technology to really destroy those bunds, it's not really helping you. So that marriage of technology, nature-based solution is something which I would advocate for. But it doesn't find a lot of favor. I mean, the position which you're saying that we are in a technology-driven phase is where governments and civil societies and organizations seem to be moving. But I think they are also realizing the fact that this is not a very long-term solution which is possible. Technology can work up to a certain level. You have to look into the local resources to really kind of effectively implement that. So there are many examples, as I said, of traditional practices, and I would really encourage all of you to kind of look back in your locality as well as to what, very simple practice of having a bandh along a river. We observe this in Kerala. I've seen it in Bihar. I've seen it in Uttar Pradesh, which is such a common practice of just blocking the river. And again, done by the community, the local community, has nothing, no fancy idea of flood mitigation, but it's just a practice which is followed. So I really encourage all of you to look back at that. But I would really advocate for technology being used to promote and propagate constructive traditional practices. Yeah. Thanks. Ayush?
Thank you so much. Yeah, Ayush, you can go ahead.
Hello, ma'am. I have a very minor question from the portion of what qualifies as a disaster management or a disaster as a tool. So, are topics like armed conflicts and wars would be considered a disaster?
That's a very interesting question, Ayush. You want to follow up? You have a follow up with that?
No, like the tension between Ukraine and Russia is going strong right now. So, would it be considered a disaster?
Okay. So, Ayush, now there are two opinions on that. One opinion says that disasters and conflicts are to be kept separately. Now, that's a very strong UN Red Cross-led opinion, that conflict and disasters are to be kept separately. The reason being, conflicts are very contentious. I mean, by its terminology itself, it's a contentious issue. So if I come up here on this and say I'm going to support Russia, okay, if hypothetically I say if I'm going to support Russia, it's a controversial position which I have taken. Or you could say you want to support Ukraine. It's again a controversial position you've taken. So for an aid organization, for a state to take these kind of positions during a conflict, it's very, very controversial, very political. So because of that, UN agencies have kept conflict very far away from disasters. And because they kept that separation, they feel that disasters are very neutral areas. It is more about development. It is more about funding and providing support, financial aid. It's not very contentious about, so if they're funding a flood mitigation program in India, no other country will have a problem with that, right? So that's why the UN-led agencies will always have this division. But as you've pointed out very correctly, conflicts and disasters have there are inherent similarities. Disasters are about emergencies where your regular resources are not sufficient to deal with the situation. The same thing is with conflict. The difference is the cause. So with disasters, we say natural and man-made disasters. With conflicts, they're all man-made events, right? But again, if you remember, we are saying there are no natural disasters. So conflicts and disasters have a lot of overlap. There are, in terms of responding to a disaster or responding to a conflict, the principles, the processes remain the same. A lot of the practices which the Red Cross used to have during conflicts have been adopted in disasters as well. So this whole idea of refugee camps, that idea in conflicts have been brought in, and that's why we have relief camps in disasters. That's the only reason why we have relief camps. So this whole special idea of relief camps after disaster happened because we have something called refugee camps in conflicts. So there are very strong overlaps. There are similarities in definition. The whole issue of social vulnerability exists in disasters. It exists in conflict as well. But the difference is that the UN-led organizations like to maintain that difference. In our master's course in Tata Institute, we recognize conflicts as a part of disasters. We see them as disasters, maybe classifying broadly as man-made disasters, but we have like specific courses on introduction to conflict and development, because one is the event which is happening, the war which is happening between Russia and Ukraine. The war will end someday. The destruction which has been there has to be some work done on that. We have to work on a post-conflict development process, which is very similar to the recovery process in disasters. So we have a lot of overlaps, and therefore it kind of falls within the same umbrella of disasters. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, ma'am, that clears it up. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I guess we can take like one more question. It's been like Saumya has been speaking for an hour straight, I just realized. But I think an important question that Aditya has asked Saumya in the chat box is, what is GIS? He wants to know. And what is its significance in disaster management? If you can help him.
Okay, so GIS, I mean, the term it's called Geographic Information System. So I'm not a technical person, so I'm far away from the disaster and technology part. But I'll tell you that GIS and science and technology in disaster, as we call it in our school, the whole idea is that we have a lot of research institutes, we have a lot of states which have their satellites up in the space. And these satellites are exceptionally brilliant in terms of taking images. So, I mean, the entire world now is practically, I mean, we have photographs of the entire world. You see one version of it is on Google Maps. Similarly, we have different satellites taking different photographs. Now, all these images can be used very effectively for research. Now, I'm giving you one of the examples. There are many, many more versions of that. And that is that when the satellite takes images of that, the layers of vegetation come in a different colors from a barren land. So you will have an image before you when you take a satellite image where the forest might look green, and the land which does not have the forest will look brown. Now you can run computer programs based on these images and will have an idea about the area which is covered by forest and the area which is barren. So in a very simple programming process, you are able to map out and get area, get the the location, get the nearest city, get information about what kind of vegetation just by running those computer programs. So that really helps you get a sense of, so if you want to find out the forest cover of India, I mean, that considering the size of the country, it's going to take a lot of time, but you can build up those maps to get an idea about what is the forest cover. And a very interesting place where it is used is to map out the sea. again, the satellite images are used. So what is the depth of the sea? So the color of the water, the difference in the color of the water, the difference in the color of the vegetation of a shrub and a tree, all of that is used to analyze and get information about the forest cover, the kind of land which is available. And a very interesting thing one of my colleague Ramesh works on, and that is figuring out landslide prone area. So there are complex formulas which they use using the condition of the soil, using the vegetation pattern, using the rainfall in that area, and they combine all of that data to figure out whether a particular area is landslide prone or not. Now, when they finally do it, it really looks like magic when they finally give us the product, but it really means collating an insane amount of data, using images, satellite images, and bringing, if you can get information about your own city that these are the landslide prone areas, you can then take actions to prevent landslides in the area. Last year, Bombay had a very bad landslide in a very close, in a locality very close to our campus. And there were maps, multiple maps, which really indicated that this is a landslide prone area. The fact that the government couldn't do something about it, that's a major issue. But those maps, GIS maps, were able to predict and show that these are your landslide prone area. So that's how GIS is used in disaster management, for informing people who are taking the decision. And then, there is another process and issue with respect to how much of this data is used in your decision-making process. That's your, whole governance issues really come in. But this is the area where you can get information, get data, which can be used effectively if you want to, for risks, getting a sense of the risk which is there. So that very interesting work in that regard. The image which I had shared on the dam, the Paulo Dam in South America, that again, a lot of the GIS work was used to get a sense of how damaged are the areas along the river. How severely has the vegetation being affected? Because the satellite maps were able to show that there has been a reduction in the agricultural cover. And again, using local data which is available, they were able to come up with information on that. So that's a very interesting area to work on. So anyone who's interested in technology, so we get a lot of students with BTech background in BTech and computer sciences who are very interested in that, because that's a very direct use of whatever they've done in their graduation in a decision-making process and in policy analysis as well. So I hope, Aditya, that's interesting for you. And please do read up on GIS. I'm pretty sure you will have much better information than me on this. But in Kerala, I could tell you what we had done with respect to studying the PDS system is that we mapped all the ration shops and the distribution centers on Google Maps. And those points which we mapped on Google Maps, because it was easily accessible for everyone, those points were taken and put on the map which the State Disaster Management Authority had given us. So by putting those two maps together, the authorities now have exact location of the ration shop, of the distribution centers during the floods, as well as the relief camps which we have mapped out. So that again is an important decision-making tool for them, because if you want to map out the distribution of resources under supply chain, you now have data which will help you out. So GIS, using maps, using these technologies is something which is very, very interested if you have that technical background, and you can always develop that background as well. I think we have one more. We can.
Yeah, maybe just one final question. Shayantika raises her hand. Shayantika, go ahead. We'll take one final question for the evening. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, Shayantika, you can unmute yourself and you can ask a question with your microphone.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yeah, a lot of disturbance. Hello.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Sorry, ma'am, there was a network issue. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, as you're mentioning right now that students from technological background, it's better for them to go for technologies in disaster management sector. But ma'am, I'm from geography background, and I had some basic understanding of GIS and mapping stuff like that. So for me, can I pursue technologies in disaster? Not in Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. No, so you can pursue technologies in disaster. It's completely up to you. We've had a lot of geography students who have pursued technologies in disasters. You may, the skill set of a computer science person or a BTech person might be slightly better, but we do have support system there. We've had people with absolutely no geography background, with like pure social science, sociology background, who have taken up technology in disaster and have done well. It's better to have that technology background. Things are faster for you, but that's not an issue. We are here for that. That's not an issue at all. You're always welcome to take that. But I also want to add one more thing there, that it's absolutely fine for technology students, BTech students, to not take science and technology in disaster management as well. That option is also there, because so we have 3 specialization: one in science and technology, one in policy and action, and one in disasters and development. So a lot of BTech students end up taking disaster policy and action, end up taking disasters and development. So that freedom is there. You have the first semester to explore what you like, understand what you like, and then depending upon your interest, you want to take what you want to have. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, so much.
All the best.
How wonderful. I think the passion towards managing disaster, mitigating disaster, disaster preparedness is so palpable. Saumya, I must say that over an hour, the vibrancy of this presentation will help us in a form of an impetus, starting with, I guess, today onwards, because this session is not definitely the end of our discussion, but a start of opportunity for all of us to contribute meaningfully to the way we are looking at preparing ourselves for disaster, being more resilient and calculated in the face of disaster, right? So that's something that really will stay with us. Thank you for your time. This has been a wonderful exposure for all of us. Sunday evening, definitely not entirely the siesta we wanted, but certainly an important hour and a half that would help us in planning more peaceful siestas, I would say, in the days ahead. Thanks a lot, participants. You have been a wonderful contributor to this discussion. Questions that you asked could only let us think more about what can be brought in terms of intervention and innovation in the sector. And we would be shortly sharing like a little feedback form back to all of you in case there are some more questions. And if for some, we can route that through Saumya eventually. We will love to support you back with more insights in this entire space and evolving dynamics of disaster management. Thanks a lot once more to each and every one of you. Thank you so much, Saumya. It's been
thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope to see you very soon in the sector as well, and hope to catch up very soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Stay well. All the best. We'll catch up soon. Bye-bye.